Spiritual psychosis, very simply defined, is an excess crown chakra, which is typically a result of spiritual addiction. Spiritual addiction doesn't always go towards the point of psychosis, but psychosis is typically always caused by that.
Some people are in spiritual psychosis and are calling it intuition, and what it actually is dangerous. They say they're ascending, but what they're actually doing is dissociating. They say they're channeling, but what they're actually doing is manipulating. And the scariest part is they believe it's the truth, or else they want you to believe it's the truth. We're going to unpack that. Today we're going to explore what happens when someone's trauma or wounding or ego hijacks their spiritual gifts, their intuition, their channeled knowledge. And how do we lovingly name that, both for ourselves and for the people inside of this field that on the one hand deserves much respect and reverence, and on the other also deserves a lot of discernment and clarity of thinking. You're listening to The Sensible Sessions. I'm your host, Amber Wardell. Along with my guests who range from experts in their fields to people with incredible experiences and perspectives, our hope is to bring you stories designed to make you laugh, make you cry, or make you think, bringing a sensible approach to a world that's lost its mind. So stay tuned and let's start the show. Welcome back to the Sensible Sessions podcast. My name is Amber Wardell. I'm a doctor of psychology and an author, and here I like to blend the magical with the scientific to show you the magic in the science and the science in the magic. Today we're going to dive into something that has been heavy on my heart and busy on my feed, and that's the blurry line between spiritual wisdom and spiritual psychosis. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about this, Amber? I think this matters a lot because historically we have seen that in times of sort of like global crisis or national crisis and trauma, people's spiritual gifts do become awakened. You start seeing more spiritual activity, more people accessing gifts they didn't know they had. It's a phenomenon that we have seen before. And I think given just the chaos of our world right now, we're just seeing a lot of it, you know? And it's really important as some of us are being exposed to this spirituality for the first time. It's important that we understand what's happening within ourselves when these intuitive or channeled messages or just like spiritual insights come to us, and also be able to recognize and discern what's happening in other people when it's happening to them. I personally believe, because I'm already seeing it on TikTok and on Instagram, we're going to begin seeing people either A, entering into actual spiritual psychosis, which we'll define in a minute, or B, starting to realize that they can use spirituality as a way to manipulate and control people. And as always, what I'm trying to do here on this channel is educate us, equip us, help us to know what to do when we see it and to recognize it in the first place, because sometimes that's the most important part of it. What is spiritual psychosis? So to break down kind of what I'm talking about here, maybe you've seen people on TikTok especially is where I see it the most. People giving channeled messages. They say, I'm here speaking to a collective or my collective, or I'm glad you're seeing this because this message is for you. And I love that content. Don't get me wrong. I love a good reading on TikTok, and a lot of times I come across ones that are just meant for me in the right moment. But I've also seen a lot of people that just instantly send up red flags for me. I'm going to get into those red flags in this video. But what I'm seeing is essentially people either, like I said, being in spiritual psychosis or actively trying to manipulate and control people. And I see that it's working. And I guess on social media, that's one thing, because there is that level of separation between the influencer, the content creator, and the audience. But what I know for a fact is that this is also happening offline. This is also happening in people's real lives. People are going to psychics and mediums a lot more than they have in the past. People are trusting in this advice, and people aren't really knowing what exactly they're getting when they speak to these people. And perhaps even weirder and more importantly is that there are people within their interpersonal relationships. So not like a client and practitioner dynamic, like if you went to go see an intuitive or a psychic or an oracle and things like that. People just within their friendships or romantic partnerships using their intuition or spiritual guidance or things that their spirit guides told them to either manipulate and control people, or to like bring other people into what is possibly a delusion. And we need to be prepared to recognize that. So that's what we're going to dive into today. And the first thing that we need to talk about is, what is spiritual psychosis? I want to start by saying I am a cognitive psychologist, and this needs to be made really clearly upfront that spiritual psychosis is not a clinical diagnosis in any way. There can be no you actively diagnosing someone with this. They're not going to get diagnosed with this if they go see a clinician. That's number one. And what I think you might pick up on as I talk about this is some of this has a lot of crossover with religion. And I'm not going to be in here talking about, I'm a Christian myself. I am not here to disrespect or downplay anybody's religious beliefs. But I do think that as we have this conversation, you will recognize that these are things that also happen in religious circles, particularly in cult-like religions, but also in just mainstream non-cult religions, where people use prophecy or God's intervention in their lives to sort of suck people into a non-reality. And all of these are dangerous, right? Whether it is a pastor, a priest, a prophet, or a psychic, nobody knows your truth and your reality better than you do. And the minute that any of these people start claiming that they have some sort of knowledge or insight or wisdom that is higher than yours when it comes to your own life, and trying to get you to make decisions and choices in your own life based on this channeled message that they got, that is dangerous. And that's why we have to talk about it.
Everyone has their own interpretation of what spiritual psychosis is, but this is how I define it based off of my teachings through Hinduism and the chakra system. Spiritual psychosis, very simply defined, is an excess crown chakra, which is typically a result of spiritual addiction. And that is going to be the case for most people in the modern new age spiritual realm. Spiritual addiction doesn't always go towards the point of psychosis, but psychosis is typically always caused by that. So basically, spiritual addiction is a result of people just really not wanting to experience what's in front of them, and they use it as a space to ascend and high vibe and so bypass and be in a space of ego. And it's really just a complete rejection of what is and the shadow. And one thing that we really should take seriously from structured religious texts is that the devil hides behind something beautiful. And that is the case in spirituality as well. Darkness likes to hide in the shadow of the light, which is why we see a lot of narcissism and abusers taking up spiritual positions. So that means you could be talking to a spirit guide or channeling light codes or working with Archangel Michael or Metatron, and that could be a dark ass energy. At the end of the day, the common theme is an avoidance of the physical world in front of you, and so you're going and exploring in that realm too much. And a lot of what causes that is absorbing too much, too fast, too soon, because it's ego. We want to know all these things to try to get us out of where we are, but knowing is not the way out. Feeling and being is. And everyone will say that they didn't realize they were in it until they came out of it and time had been spent and they were like, oh shoot, I think that was what I was in.
I'm just going to give a couple examples of what spiritual psychosis may look like. Remember, we're not diagnosing anyone. We're just saying these are some hints. These are some clues that this is happening. Okay, so one of them might be interpreting an ordinary negative thing as a spiritual attack. You see this a lot. And some people will use this language colloquially, or they may even use it as just a comfort blanket for themselves, where they say oh, this thing is happening to me. It's a spiritual attack, I guess. And it's more of a coping mechanism. I want to set that aside and talk about people who actually go into a paranoid state, believing that losing their job or getting an offender bender or something is a spiritual attack against them. And often this will come along with things like, they know where I'm headed, they know where I'm going, they see my power, and they're trying to stop me. And maybe, but when you're seeing that, in addition to some of the other things we're going to discuss, it can be a red flag. Another one, and this is a huge one for me, is when they begin trying to sell you their channeled messages or intuitive insights as the ground truth, as the absolute truth. And this is especially when it comes to other people's lives. And I want to make this caveat, we all have intuition. We all have a deep inner knowing. And a lot of us have been taught to be disconnected from it for most of our lives, particularly if we're women and particularly if we were raised in religious environments. But we all have the ability to access intuition, that feeling in your gut that tells you something is wrong here, or I need to move away from this, or I need to move toward it. We all have that. And any person at any time is allowed and encouraged to use whatever insights or intuition or gut feelings they have about something to direct their own actions. I'm fully on board with that. Where I think it starts becoming a problem is when people are using their intuition or channeled messages to force someone else to comply with what their intuition is telling them. And you'll find that those people tend to become very fragile and brittle and defensive when you suggest that what they're telling you doesn't match with the ground truth. I had a very weird circumstance a few months ago like that, where someone who was a psychic told me something very alarming and dramatic and disturbing about something that was going to happen in the future. And I listened and I just said, okay, but what you're telling me doesn't align with the facts, what I know about this person, what I know about this situation, what I know about our relationship. And my own intuition, my own discernment could feel there was an intent behind what she was telling me. I felt it. I got very discomforted. And I just said, I was just trying to be nice, trying to keep it casual. And I said, yeah, okay. I just don't think that really lines up with what I know to be true. And she folded her hands and she said, well, it sounds like you have it all figured out then. And we had many moments like that in our conversations where she would suggest something that had that was supposed to compel me to behave in a certain way. And when I would disagree, there was defensiveness. There was almost insult about it, which leads me into my point number 3, which is where they use like these psychic downloads or channeled messages as a way to control or isolate others. And this one is very scary to me because I've seen it personally, not just in the example I just gave, but even in a friend group that I was in a year ago. This was happening, and it was just a person using the things their spirit guides were telling them to isolate people in our friend group from each other and from their romantic partners. And it was a scary time for us all. And I think that what can be really challenging about this is often people who are in this space of this spiritual psychosis, they believe it. I need to parse out that sometimes it's about manipulation and control, trying to get you to buy into this delusion that they're selling. And other times, that has to set aside from spiritual psychosis, which is where they actually believe this. And so they're going to sound very confident, very convicted in what they are saying. And it's going to be hard to hear this and to not buy into it a little bit, because it in some ways it's going to sound helpful. In some ways it's going to sound conspiratorial, like I'm here to help. I have this special insight for you. But in reality, it functions as either avoidance or superiority and can also be incredibly controlling. And I imagine a lot of you are listening to this and thinking of situations that have happened to you that feel like this. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. And so I want to talk a little bit about, I want to humanize this really quickly, because I think there are some really serious reasons why someone can slip into what can be perceived as spiritual psychosis. And those deserve to be acknowledged. So let's talk about that next. Possible causes. What causes spiritual psychosis? Again, this is not me speaking as a psychologist, because once again, this is not a clinical diagnosis. Okay, so this is just observations that I've made and that I've listened to other people talk about when it comes to someone sort of going off the deep end, drinking the Kool-Aid of their own intuition and spirituality a little bit too much. Okay, keep that in mind. So although I am not using this in any kind of clinical sense, I do want to talk about how there can be psychological roots that go into someone slipping into this spiritual psychosis, because I believe that there really are some. First and foremost, these are trauma. A person who has been traumatized and who is maybe even on their healing journey, but still has many triggers and traumas that have not been dealt with yet, when one of those triggers comes along, it can send them into this space, this space of detachment, of dissociation from reality. We see this in trauma victims all the time, and this one is just a slightly different flavor. This is, instead of dissociating into maybe a different kind of aspect of themselves, or into isolation or whatever that may be, this is slipping into a spiritual superiority, a leaning too far into intuition and not enough into grounded material truth. This can also be the result of a disorganized attachment style, someone who doesn't know how to feel safe and secure in their relationships. And so they somehow, as like maybe a coping mechanism, allow themselves to go into this space of it's almost like spiritual narcissism. I have next in my notes that it comes from narcissistic wounds. And I think you could blend those two together really, really nicely. I had a friend use this term to describe someone in her life recently, and I didn't put much thought into it until just now. But yes, this is like spiritual narcissism. Remember, even narcissism comes from wounding. We don't know the exact cause of narcissism, but there is a lot of belief that some of it is hereditary and some of it is it comes from wounding. It comes from our environment. It comes from an unsafe, unstable environment where a person perceived to have no control at one time. And in the same way that we can understand that narcissistic traits, not a diagnosed narcissist, but narcissistic traits can come out kind of unconsciously as more of like a coping mechanism, and they can be done intentionally through manipulation and control. I think we can see spiritual narcissism in the same way. This way that someone on the one hand might be doing it unconsciously. They are actually in spiritual psychosis and they believe everything that they are saying, or they could be of the variety where they kind of are aware of what they're doing and they're using it to manipulate and control. This can also stem from just a hunger for meaning, for higher purpose, a desire to feel special and important. And no one can prove that this person is or isn't more spiritually inclined than anybody else. And so I think that going into this sort of this spiritual narcissism, I guess is what I'm going to call it, is their way of finding a personal sense of meaning. And the word superiority is coming to me, but that's got such a negative connotation to it. I think it's more about see me as important, see me as meaningful, see me as special, because maybe that person hasn't been treated that way for much of their life. In the end, spiritual psychosis, it really stems from spiritual bypassing and ego inflation. I think those are really the only two things that you can attribute it to, is like a disassociation in some way, plus ego and wounding stepping in. I think for many people who slip into this, who find themselves in this spiritual psychosis, and again, we're just grounding this in their humanity for a minute, right? I think that for people like this, oftentimes it can be a feeling of, I've been powerless for so long. And so that voice inside of their head says, you're above this. You are better than this. You are superior to this. And it can sound a lot like healing, but it also can be something pretty dangerous. Especially, like I said, when this is being used to get other people to behave or believe in certain ways.
How to identify it?
So because this can be so dangerous, it's really important that we ourselves have a way of kind of determining. I think for ourselves too, it's always good to check in with ourselves as we're messing with our own intuition and channeled messages and whatnot, to ask these questions of ourselves, but also to be asking these questions of people who are attempting to give us spiritual advice and leadership and wisdom. What do we need to know in order to discern for ourselves if what's coming out of this person or what's coming up in our own minds is grounded in truth and in reality and not in delusion? I think the number one thing to look for is this loving? Is it humble? And is it clear? I've done readings for people before where I've had to give sort of uncomfortable advice, uncomfortable knowledge of something that I'm seeing in their life. And that's always hard, but it can also be done lovingly, right? when you're in this context of like, I am doing a reading for you, I am getting a channeled message for you, that's very different than when you're just like having a conversation with a friend about your beliefs about their actions or behaviors or how they've hurt you. This is different. There's a different level of ethics that has to be involved. And so is it, even when they're sharing something difficult, is it loving? Does it appear to be rooted in love? Is it humble, meaning does it appear to be rooted in your best interest or in their ego? And 3, is it clear? I mean, you can just tell immediately from someone's energy, from their presence, if they are having clarity of thought in what they are sharing with you, or if they seem disorganized or chaotic or dramatic. These can be signs that this is not coming from a clear and grounded and centered place. If you're someone who has mentors around you, whether that's a therapist or maybe a wise grandparent or something like that, run that information that this person is giving you, this advice, this insight, past them in your mind. Would my therapist say that this makes sense, that this is right? Would my Nana say that this sounds right? Think about what this person who doesn't know you is saying to you, and would your therapist, would your best friend, would your spouse, would your grandmother also give you this advice and lead you in this direction? 3rd, check the motive. Does this appear to be in seeking the truth or in seeking control? And I've really been thinking hard about this one, because I think that often when we think about people who are intuitive or psychically gifted, we think that they should never ask questions. We think that if they start asking questions, well, now they're fishing. They're fishing for info so that they can be more convincing with what they're telling you. And in my personal opinion, both when I try to do messages for other people and when people have given them to me, the most useful, helpful, clear, kind, and humble people have been willing to ask me questions. And usually those questions begin with, how does this line up with what you know, with the facts about your life, with your reality? How does this feel in your body when you hear this? And when a person says, well, I don't know, that doesn't really line up with what I know about this or what I know about my life, that person will then pivot and say, they're comfortable saying, okay, well, maybe then what I'm sensing or what I'm feeling is related to this thing. Does that make more sense? And they have enough confidence in themselves to know that if you think that they're fishing for information, that's just going to have to be okay. They're more interested in trying to help you than they are in preserving this image that they're not a snake oil salesman. You know what I mean? If they're seeking truth, they're willing to ask questions. They're willing to accept you questioning the extent of their gift in order to get to the truth. If they're not willing to accept questions that you have or pushback that you have, then it's probably more about control. And I think a good, just sort of a thing to keep in mind as you're dealing, whether you're watching videos on TikTok about this or dealing with a friend or an actual psychic that you're visiting, is if it's real wisdom, if it's real spiritual guidance, it will not demand worship, obedience, or fear. If you're sensing those things, big red flag. And I'm just going to add one more thing that I don't have in my notes here, but that I just think is important, is a person who is trying to give spiritual insights and advice to other people will be engaging actively in grounding techniques for themselves. Maybe that's therapy, but maybe that is just having an accountability partner, someone else who is also spiritually inclined, that they're running their belief system through. When they feel like maybe they're getting detached a little bit, but getting too up in the higher chakras into the intuition and insight and less in reality and truth, they will run this by someone else. Maybe they're going into meditation. Maybe they're going on walks, doing things to help them stay grounded in what's real and not what's going on up here. Listen, at the end of the day, the whole reason why this conversation is important is because there are so many of us who have a genuine desire to learn and to grow, and we're reaching out to mentors everywhere we can find them. And that may mean therapists, that may mean spiritual guides in a religious setting, and that may be people who are spiritually inclined in the more woo-woo kind of way. And I think that's all good. That's all great and wonderful. I think anytime we are out searching for more truth, that is a good thing. But in any of these scenarios, there is the possibility to be misled. This is why I will always push people toward therapy, because there are guidelines around that. These people have to be licensed and certified. There is a board that they have to be accountable to, licensure that they can lose. Whereas that's not always the case, not in religious organizations, and especially not in a completely unregulated field like psychic mediumship and things like that. That's not to discredit or say that there's anything wrong with this. I clearly am part of this world and community. I'm just saying, if you're looking for advice that you know can be trusted and credible, or at least can be held accountable when it's not those things, you're going to find that in therapy. So just know that it's okay and it's good to be seeking out wisdom and truth wherever you can find it. You just need to know the signs to look for when that wisdom, that truth, that insight is not grounded in truth, not grounded in reality. And you need to be safe and comfortable to push and pull away from that when you need to. I'll say it again. The most powerful intuitives I know are humble. They are the most humble. They are willing and the first to say, I could be wrong, to say, I guess I was wrong. And that's not a weakness. That is spiritual maturity. That is someone who has your best interest at heart and nothing else. No ego, no delusion, no grasping for control. And those are the things that you want, not the opposite of that, which is the stuff that's leaning into spiritual psychosis. And I guess as we kind of found out through this whole dialogue, spiritual narcissism as well. So that's going to do it for me, guys. This, by the way, I know this is a different setup. This is my new house. Actually, if you've been here long enough, you will recognize this as my old house that I lived in 5 years ago, and we have moved back into it, which is really exciting. If you want a story time on all that, I'd be happy to share. But I know my channel has pivoted a lot. I don't really talk about my personal stuff anymore, so let me know if you want to see that. If this landed for you, I would love to stay connected to you. If you could hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, just because it helps get this video out there to other people who might need to see it. All of my social media links are also down below. I'm most active on TikTok and Instagram, but you can find me all over the place, so check me out there. Until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and remember, real magic never asks you to leave reality behind. Love ya, mean it, always, mwah. And I'll see you in the next one.